I've talked about Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach a lot on this channel, but I usually focus on small details or the true identities of the main characters in those theories. Today, however, I want to take a slightly different approach by tackling Security Breach's biggest mystery, literally. This is the Tangle, or as it's more widely known, the Blob. This thing is a mess of wires, pieces from previous FNAFSB animatronics, and likely far grislier things. But we'll get there when we get there. Even though I've briefly mentioned it in past theories, today's the day I want to lay out everything we know on the table and actually solve this thing. And heck, maybe I'll even solve some other stuff along the way. So without further ado, fellow theorists, let's untangle the mystery of the Blob. The Blob has only appeared twice in the games. The first time in Security Breach, where we see it in the Burn Trap ending, and the second in that game's DLC expansion, Ruin, where we can catch a quick glimpse of it at the very beginning of the game. So, right off the bat, we don't have much to work with. But don't worry, friends, because this isn't where it ends. In the Tales from the Pizzaplex epilogues, the pile of machinery and corpses the Mimic creates is called a Tangle multiple times. I don't think this is the actual Tangle, but it's little similarities like this that will help. More on this in a bit. Let's go over the animatronics that can be found inside the Blob and see if that can help us. Here's the list. Chica, Bonnie, Mangle, Baby, the Puppet, and some Endo-02s, which are the model of endoskeleton used by the toy animatronics. Remember this detail because it will get important later. The Blob itself is piloted by the head of Funtime Freddy. Right off the bat, this created a problem in solving what the Blob was meant to be. Funtime Freddy and Circus Baby should be destroyed because of the fire we see in FNAF 6, and we see the original animatronics disassembled in FNAF 3. So, what's going on here? Well, the now shut down FNAF AR tells us the story. You see, these animatronics aren't the original ones, they're the remade versions from said game. We also know these were likely sent to the Pizzaplex, as we see a large shipment of animatronics being sent there in the epilogues of Tales from the Pizzaplex. So it's possible they were abandoned in the Pizzaplex's basement and somehow formed into the Blob. But how? Well, let's find out. The FNAF Character Encyclopedia hints at the fact that the Blob has its origins in Ennard. This makes sense since both of those entities would be in the sinkhole under the Pizzaplex. But what's actually powering this thing? Why is it so aggressive and hostile? Well friends, the answer lies in FNAF 6. Through the blueprints we see in that game's Insanity ending, we learn that Remnant is destroyed or freed using fire. Now, before we dive into the nit and grit of this, let me explain what Remnant and Agony actually are. Agony is created through strong emotions. It's a black, goopy liquid that permits souls to possess metal objects, like animatronics. When agony-infused metal is melted down, it creates Remnant, which can be injected into hosts via the scooper we see in Sister Location. So even if Henry's plan in FNAF 6 succeeded and all the Remnant's effects were neutralized, that leaves the agony unaccounted for. But for a giant mound of rubble to act like this, it must need a lot of agony. So where could all of the agony necessary for this come from? Well, theorists, the answer to this is both extremely complicated and super simple. Confused? Well, let's start untangling this mystery and find out. Remember how I said there were a bunch of Endo-02s in the Blob? Well, theorists, these right here could be the reason the Blob is filled with so much agony. You see, the missing children incident wasn't the only set of murders that William Afton did back in the 1980s. There was another, the Dead Children incident, where William killed 5 kids at the newly reopened Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, or the location we play in FNAF 2. These are the murders we see in the Save Them minigame from FNAF 2. While I used to be strongly against the theory that the toys are possessed, I've become more open to it as time went by. Them being possessed perfectly explains why their activities get weirder and more paranormal as the week progresses, or why they all have the iconic silver eyes that are a very clear sign of possession, just like the original Freddy Fazbear Band. Those dead kids were close enough to the toy animatronics for their agony to go into them, and even if they weren't stuffed like the MCI, there's a factor that practically ensures they possess the toys, and that factor is the puppet. In the latest FNAF Tales from the Pizzaplex book, B72, in the story Alone Together, we're told that spirits won't accept their deaths until their body is found. We see the puppet guide the MCI kids to possess the FNAF 1 animatronics and to live on. The puppet isn't actually stuffing the kids into the suits. William did that. This is just a spiritual representation of the kids' agony binding their souls to said animatronics. The puppet is essentially taking on the role of a shepherd, so who's to say it couldn't have done the same thing to the FNAF 2 kids? So let's say the Endo-02s inside the toys have agony and souls possessing them. What does this have to do with the Blob? Well, those Endo-O2s inside the Blob could be the possessed ones we just talked about. But that's not the end of it, because I believe the Blob is a collection of every single haunted object from across the entire franchise. This is similar to Agony from the FNAFSB Fights epilogues. It's a giant pile of possessed trash, infested with agony. But here's the interesting thing. Agony is defeated when it falls into a lake and it's dissolved. There's a lake under the Pizzaplex, next to where we find the Blob. So if this is where all the possessed stuff from across the franchise ended up, the Blob is an extremely powerful being. It's so large and so potent, it's likely the one that caused the damage done to the Pizzaplex we see in Ruin. If that thing escapes from the Pizzaplex's basement, it can destroy entire towns. And this isn't even where the agony evidence ends. It's also possible that the Blob is where the agony of all the people who died at the Pizzaplex went. Let me explain. Throughout the Tales from the Pizzaplex books, there's loads of deaths. I mean it. At least 4 people die per book. But here's the thing. 99.9% of those deaths occur at the Mega Pizzaplex. FNAFSB Entertainment will obviously want to hide the grisly deaths going on at their flagship location. We see this firsthand in Clyphophobia. As the main character Grady is dying, he's abandoned by his co-workers. And since FNAFSB doesn't want anyone to know about the stuff going on, they chuck the bodies where no one will find them, in the basement of the Pizzaplex. The deaths in these books are also far grislier and more gruesome than anything we've seen before. They're brutal, sickening, agonizing. That's right, I believe these extremely gruesome deaths generate even more agony, on top of all the stuff we already had in the Blob beforehand. The workers and teens killed off in the Tales epilogues also contribute to the fantastic amounts of agony and Remnant coursing through this heap of Freddy spaghetti. If just some scraps of Remnant were enough to make the Fun Times aware, imagine how powerful and how much of a threat the Blob actually is. So how about we go over every single force that could be powering this thing? First off, there's definitely some MCI agony in here. Like I said earlier, the Remnant souls might have been freed in FNAF 3 and 6, but the emotional energy they left behind is still present. This explains why the main part of the Blob is pitch black, agony is the same color, as well as also being liquid. Since we're on the topic of dead kids, the DCI from FNAF 2 are almost certainly in the mix as well. If the DCI souls went into the toy animatronics, that means there's a bunch of agony and soul energy left unaccounted for. We know thanks to the newspaper we see at the end of FNAF 2 that the toys were scrapped. We never see them in the franchise ever again. This is a huge hole in Henry's plan in Pizzeria Sim. Even if the toy parts we see in FNAF 3 are real, the toy endos are absent, and those are the ones that contain the toy souls. And here they are, bang splat in the middle of the Blob. There's likely some agony from the Aftons and the Fun Times in here too. After all, those burn to the ground nearby. The Blob also has strong Funtime imagery with pieces of baby in it and a literal Funtime Freddy head piloting it. Which brings us to our next power source, the FNAF AR animatronics. I've already explained that the animatronics pieces we see in the Blob aren't from the actual ones, they're from the rebooted ones we see in the late FNAF AR. This explains why Chica looks so different from how we saw her in FNAF 1, and why characters like Circus Baby and Funtime Freddy are present when they should be destroyed. The entire gameplay loop of FNAF AR was all about us collecting Remnant and Agony and forcefully injecting it into our animatronics. Even more energy in the Blob. We also have the book victims, but I went into detail on those a while back, so it feels redundant to reiterate what I've already said. And lastly, the puppet. The only one who isn't in FNAF AR. The one who should have passed on after FNAF 6, but is still here for some unknown reason. For a while, I honestly had no idea what to make of this thing, but I think I might know now. In the true ending of FNAF 6, we see all the animatronics from that game burn, except for one, Lefty. And though that's the last we see of the LEFTE suit, it's not the last we see of the puppet. As other theorists have pointed out, there's loads of puppet imagery in Security Breach. There's the weird black and white wires and the Nightmarion plushies everywhere. And while I want to talk in depth about the puppet another time, I'm sure that Charlotte Emily is around. But anything more than that will have to wait for next time. So with that, that's all the evidence I have on the Blob. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment if you enjoyed, and never stop overthinking. And remember, hit the bell icon so you know when I solve the puppet, coming up soon.